Amen.
All right, well, how about we get started? It's just about 5 after. We'll keep letting people in as they show up, but I want to make sure we give Rabbi Moeller his fully allotted time. I'm Rabbi Boxman. Session 3 of our Between the Lines session, Between Lines series. I want to remind you of 2 things. One is if you have a question or a comment, the easiest way to let us know is by raising your hand virtually. So as a reminder, kind of scroll over your name, you'll have an option to raise hand. And that's going to be great because it lets us know not only that you have a question, but it also puts it in order so that we get to your questions or comments in the order that you ask them. If you also would like to speak, I'm going to in just a moment mute everybody. But if you would like to make a question, you'll have to unmute yourself. I no longer, as the host, have the ability to unmute you. I can ask you to unmute, but you ultimately have to do that yourself. And the way you do that is you go, you scroll over the part where it says mute or unmute, and you just click on that, and that will unmute. All right. Any questions before we get started?
So, Rabbi, just a quick thing. On my computer, I can't raise my hand by clicking on my name. I have to go to participants. And then if I go under participants, there's the option to raise hand.
Great, thank you. So yes, different formats. If you have a computer versus an iPad or a laptop, they might have different ways. So either scroll over your name or do what Susan said, go to the participant list and you'll see an option to raise hand.
All right, and Rabbi Boxman, I changed the chat so it can go to just you, I believe.
Oh, fabulous. Okay, if you want to send a chat, I will see that as well, and I'll make sure to monitor it.
Okay.
All right, so let me have 1 moment. I'm going to mute everybody and then unmute Rabbi Moeller, and he will begin. All right, Rabbi Moeller, you can unmute yourself.
All right, there we go. We all set?
We're all set?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 3rd session of our book discussion group on the Stars of David. I'm assuming that we don't have any newcomers for the first time this afternoon, so I'm not going to go over the Jewish identity spectrum, and you'll see it revealed as we go on, because we have a lot to cover today. And we're going to start with Jason Alexander of Seinfeld fame. I'm sure that many of you have saw him recently as opening the Saturday night Seder that was done virtually during Passover week. He was terrific. His timing on that opening song was wonderful. Yeah, he's just so smooth, so cool, just the opposite of George Costanza, the character that he played. But you know his chapter is going to be funny when it starts out with, it says in the Torah that you're allowed to eat shrimp and bacon when you go to a Chinese restaurant. So I probably laughed more in this chapter than any of the others. Jason Alexander grew up as Jay Greenspan, and it was a fairly observant family. They kind of did everything by the book. They did all the Jewish holidays, and they kept kosher, except when they went out to eat Chinese. And Jason called it was a pig parade. Kind of an unusual term to use, but actually reminded me of the joke of the rabbi who led an Orthodox congregation, but he had a little penchant, a little yang for Chinese food. So he'd drive 50 miles out of town to get away from his congregants, and he ordered a suckling pig, and it was served with a baked apple in its mouth. And he was just about to start eating it when, would you believe it, the president of his temple walked in and said, "Rabbi, I cannot believe it. How could you be eating that?" He said, "You would not believe this. I ordered a baked apple and look how they served it." So that reminded me of the pig parade described by Jason Alexander. And he used it as an opportunity to bargain with his parents, because he saw it as the ultimate hypocrisy. You know, keeping kosher shouldn't just be, you know, keeping kosher at home, but it's really, if it's what goes into your body, then it should be observed wherever you go. So he said, you know what, if the tradition and the ritual means that little to you, I'm not going to Hebrew school anymore. I'm out. And so that was what he wanted to do. And his father said to him, no, you have to go to Hebrew school. And Jason said, why? And he said, because there are people in this world who would kill you just because you're a Jew, and you need to know what you're dying for. So that's what his father told him. And what a great incentive program to be Jewish. But that's what he heard. So he toughed it out through his bar mitzvah. And but he dreaded Sunday school, and he dropped out the minute that he could. He just had trouble with God. He couldn't find any meaning in the rituals. So he stopped doing everything. He didn't fast for Yom Kippur, nothing. But if you remember the character from Seinfeld, George Costanza was a bit of a warrior, a worrywart, and he's no different in real life, because the first time that he broke the fast on Yom Kippur, he thought, wow, if I'm wrong, this is going to be a death sentence. So he kind of took Woody Allen's approach, who said, I don't believe in an afterlife, but I'm taking a change of underwear just in case. One of his great lines, in addition to one of his other ones, which I've always liked, which is, I hate reality, but it's the only place to get a good steak. So anyway, Jason hedged his bets, and he said, I'm not going to shul this Shabbat, but no offense, don't take it personally, God. He says he married a Jewish woman by accident. He was looking for a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, high-cheekboned, Aryan, Nordic woman, not your typical average Jewish lady. But he found a Jewish woman to marry and found her very attractive. His parents were relieved because his siblings had already intermarried, but he didn't do this for his parents. He says he wasn't that good of a son. But he later saw the wisdom in his choice, and I want to read just an excerpt. Now that he's been married to Dana Title for 24 years, Alexander says that sharing a similar background helps. The more common your mutual knowledge is to each other, the easier it becomes. Not that it isn't fascinating to have your eyes open to all new things by someone you're in love with, but that on that particular level of religious background, there's nothing that divides us. So there was no question about who's going to marry us, or if we have kids, what will they be. Dana and I both grew up with 27 Yiddish tunes that we can reference when needed. So that was a good decision for him. But Dana was very strongly egalitarian, and she said, when we get married, when you do the Hare at Mikudeshet Li, you're consecrated unto me as my wife, I want to do the same because you're going to be consecrated to me. So I guess in an Orthodox wedding, it's only the guy who says that, but at least in Reform, I've always done it in an egalitarian way. But she insisted on that, and he agreed. There was also an issue with the circumcision of their son Gabe, who was born in 1991. He's about 30 years old now, and Noah is 25 years old. He was born in 1996. But Gabe was born as a preemie, and they were very concerned about doing circumcision, and they went back and forth. They really were struggling with it. In the end, they decided that he was going to have the ceremony. And let me read this excerpt to you. It was a real decision with Gaby for many reasons, not the least of which was that Gaby was born sick. He was born with a pneumonia-like infection, and he was in intensive care for 10 days before going home. This whole notion that a perfect little baby comes out, and then he's sick, and then we put him through this living hell for the first 10 days of his life, and then we say, and now we're going to whack the tip of his you-know-what off, just didn't feel right. We went back and forth on it. Apparently many couples do it because there's a desire on the father's part to have his son look like him, but I had none of that. At least I was conscious of. We did it only because we said, look, we're probably going to give them a Jewish education of some kind, and it is possible that our sons will have more of a feeling for this than we do and want to be more religious than we are, in which case they're going to be ostracized for not being circumcised. That sounds like a title of a good book, right? Ostracized for not being circumcised. So why don't we just get it over with while there's no memory of it and no stigma on it? And that's what we opted to do. But it was not a slam dunk. It was a real hard decision. So I guess their allegiance to Jewish identity won out in that particular instance. And he enrolled his boys in Sunday school. But would you believe he told them exactly what his parents told him? There are people in this world who will kill you just because you're a Jew, so you better know what you're dying for. Talk about heritage tradition in the negative. He did something that his parents did, but it wasn't a real positive thing. But that's what he did, probably because he didn't have a better answer. It kind of reminds me of when, kids ask their parents, well, why do I have to go to Sunday school? And the typical answer is, I suffered, you're going to do the same. Kind of that thinking. He had a life-changing experience at 29 years old when he went to the state of Israel for a trip. And it was it impacted him not in a religious way, but culturally speaking, and in terms of the importance of the history of Israel and of the Jewish people. So he wanted to take his sons after their bar mitzvah to Israel so they would get that same experience and understand how real and important the history is. He became involved in peace efforts in Israel, but he hesitates to really be at the forefront of a Jewish cause. He's a little sheepish about that. I think he carries some Jewish self-doubt and self-consciousness in that area. He talks a little bit about Seinfeld, and by the way, I've been cleaning up my office this past week, and it's amazing. I found some interesting things. I'm going to show, here's a magazine. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see it? It's from 1998. It was, I think, the last episode of Seinfeld, or the ultimate fact-filled farewell guide to America's #1 comedy. So here's this magazine I saved for 22 years. Were you able to see that, by the way? Could you see it? Okay, good. I have a couple other show and tells too, so I wanted to make sure that worked. But anyway, so he talks about Seinfeld, and he says it was a Jewish show without it really intentionally being Jewish. Remember, Jerry Seinfeld used to say, this is a show about nothing. And every week it just sort of, the plots developed out of nothing. But it really was a Jewish show. Think about it. Think about some of the Jewish episodes that only we, could understand. And we wondered if non-Jews really would get it. How about the soup Nazi? Or the bar mitzvah episode? Or the hilarious episode with the moil who hated children? And then my favorite, which was the insensitive rabbi who blabbed all of his congregants' secrets to the immediate world. Remember the Seinfeld rabbi? So it was full of Jewish allusions, and I think a lot of times we were the only ones who got it. But it was more than that, because as Jason states it, there was kind of a Jewish gestalt on the show without it really being intentionally Jewish. And whenever he got together with the cameramen and the writers and just all those who were involved with the show, they kind of just had a connection that really wasn't there with the rest. In other words, you had to be Jewish. So Larry David, Jerry Seinfeld, and Jason Alexander, and the network guys, they would all get together, and there would just be this understanding that they all had with each other because of this Jewish association factor. So he gets association points for that. They were just a happy Jewish family, and their Jewish identity just kind of oozed through. All right. He still uses the name Greenspan on his legal documents. His children have retained the name, but he kind of likes to hide behind Alexander. And now remember, this book was written in 2005, so it was post-2001, and he felt just a very sheepish sense of proclaiming his Jewish identity in public, because he was kind of afraid, and he writes about that he would absolutely not admit, if all the Jews were called to the front of the plane, he would not be stepping forward. He does not take well to Jews who have a Christmas tree. He feels you're either with us or you're against us. And he believes that whatever he accomplished in his career was because of his Jewishness. And this is the line that I picked. I thought that was the salient line that we should remember. And I'll read this to you. The true answer is, I don't think I could have accomplished what I've accomplished without being a Jew. I think that my essence is supremely Jewish. It oozes out of every pore. And since most of my acceptance as a celebrity or as an actor has been as a comedic actor, the sensibilities of Jewish humor, culture, and background are so much the basis for what I think that is funny. So he really is said, his cultural ethnic identity, he used it to his advantage to create this character, that we see on Seinfeld. There's so much that's Jewish about George Costanza. I mean, I always thought his parents were Frank and Estelle. I thought those were her real parents. They played it so well. Jerry Stiller and Estelle Harris, they were fabulous in that role. So if we could flash up the Jewish identity spectrum for George Costanza, we can take a look at that now. So he has, because of how he used his cultural background to establish his acting career, I gave him a significant number of culture, ethnicity, and the association, the way he talked about the connection he had with the crew and the writers on Seinfeld. Clearly he had, and he married Jewish. Clearly, association is important to him. He's advocated on behalf of Israel peace efforts. He's been to Israel, wanted to take his kids there, so he clearly gets some points for Israel Zionism. The anti-Semitism and otherness came through in just his fear of proclaiming being Jewish to the outside world in certain circumstances. And he mentioned the importance of the history of Israel and how real that is to him. So that's how I divided his Jewish identity spectrum. And now we're going to turn it over to Rabbi Boxman, who has a personal connection to Jason Alexander.
Thank you. So my connection to Jason Alexander is really through my father. So my father, as many of you know, Rabbi Brad Boxman, is a rabbi in Parkland, Florida. And a few years ago, this elderly woman came in. Her name was Ruth Greenspan. And she said to him, Rabbi, I want to take a tour of the synagogue before I join. I specifically would like to see the sanctuary because I'd like to see where I'm going to have my funeral someday. And he laughed. I mean, that's sort of an unusual thing to hear. Got to talking to her. And then she revealed that she is the Ruth Greenspan, the mother of what's his actual name? Jay. Is it Jay? Jay Greenspan, and who then she explained is Jason Alexander. And that's an interesting story too, how he got Jason Alexander. His father's name is Alexander, so Jay, son of Alexander, is how he became Jason Alexander.
Oh, great.
Yeah, interesting. But what happened is she became very close with my family. We started inviting her every week for Shabbat dinner. She would come to our house for Passover Seder. And it happened once when we invited her for Shabbat dinner. She said, "Oh, Jason happens to be in town. Would you mind if I brought him?" So of course we all said, "Well, of course, absolutely." I think my mom went nuts trying to figure out the perfect meal to serve to Jason Alexander. But he was just lovely. He was such a nice and humble man. If you didn't know who he was, you would think he was just any other, nice man who came to dinner. So that was years ago. We over the last, I would say, 7 years, we've developed a really nice relationship. His mother has since passed, but he does still keep in touch with my father. In fact, he just recently sent my father a 60th birthday message, which was really sweet. And I just have to say, he's a wonderful man. And I have a quick picture to share from when him and I went out to dinner a few years ago. So
Wow.
That's all. I'll turn it back over to Rabbi Mueller.
That's awesome. So when your mother was thinking of what to make him for dinner, did she think of shrimp and bacon or taking him to Chinese?
No, although his mom does absolutely, or she did love Chinese, and that's where we would take her often. And his humor comes from his mother. She is was hilarious.
Oh, okay. So the baked apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right?
That's right.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was a great personal connection. I have one more thing to show. This is a Festivus celebration kit. I picked this up a few years ago, and there's Frank Costanza right there on the front of that. So this is one of my keepsakes from Seinfeld, and of course I have the Seinfeld trivia game. All right. Does anyone have any thoughts, responses? Anyone else have a personal connection to Jason Alexander, or anything they'd like to share before we move on to Leonard Nimoy?
I don't see any raised hands or anything in the chat. So if you would like to say something, you just need to unmute yourself. All right. I think you're good to go.
All right, we move on with Leonard Nimoy, and this was something else I found as I was going through things. This is a Mad magazine from October 1976, and there you see on the cover Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner with Alfred E. Newman. I don't know, when I raise it up, it seems to disappear. Can you still see it? No, only like this. Yeah. So this is pretty old. It's been going back, gosh, almost 50 years. So Leonard Nimoy starts out with a little bit more of a somber opening than Jason Alexander. For him, and forgive my language, he starts out, "Jew bastard" was something I heard a lot. That's how he began. He grew up in an Orthodox family in Boston, and as a kid, he started to enjoy magic. And so there was a magic shop around the corner, and he'd go in there every so often when he had a few pennies to buy a coin trick or whatever it was, and got to know the proprietor. And one day, he slipped a little brochure into the bag. And as Leonard left the store, he looked into the bag, and it was the most disgusting, anti-Semitic stuff that you could ever possibly imagine, with the image of the hoary, hook-nosed Jew, and just a disgusting piece of anti-Semitic propaganda. And he was just so upset by that someone he thought that he knew and trusted, this man, could hate Jews like that and could give him something so insidious. So he never told his parents about it, but he carried it with him for a long time. And he lived, his home was near a large Catholic church. And so on Sundays, when the Italian and Irish kids would come out, his parents said, "You have to be careful because they just learned that the Jews killed their Christ. So you want to be careful and watch out for yourself." As a matter of fact, his parents told him something that was quite shocking and almost something that we can relate to, which is going on right now in our world. Had his parents prepared him for the bigotry? "My parents were very fearful people," he says, "and their fear was itself an education. Jews were always to keep a low profile so as not to become targets. Don't boast about success or brag about it. Stay amongst your own people. Stay out of the wrong neighborhoods. They came from a village in Russia that had experienced pogroms, so they were really quite ghettoized." You know, in the last few weeks, we've seen in the aftermath of George Floyd, African-American parents have been talking about what they tell their kids. It's called the talk. Don't resist police, do what they tell you, don't make trouble. This is almost a Jewish version of the talk. And I'd never heard of that before, where you'd be told as a Jew, you better be careful and stay out of the wrong neighborhoods. That was quite eye-opening and revealing. So, there are obvious differences between the Black Lives Matter movement and Jewish anti-Semitism, but you certainly don't have to be Jewish to understand the horrors of the Holocaust, and you don't have to be Black to understand the wrong that's been going on, and just the horror of lynching either. So that's what our society is grappling with now. And I think it's again, it's a situation where all prejudice, discrimination has to be rooted out of our culture. It's going to take a long time, and Black Lives Matter is a good beginning. But that's a discussion for another time. But clearly, Leonard Nimoy felt that fear. He learned Yiddish from his grandmother, and he became fluent. And his parents taught him to get a good education for the purpose of making a decent living. And under the study learning category, I have indicated it's not just learning Jewish texts, but our people focuses on study and learning and education so you can get a good job and make a decent living. It's kind of like the old Jewish joke. The man goes into the hospital and he's laid up in the bed, and the nurse comes in and says, "Are you comfortable?" He says, "I make a living." So that's kind of that I think every Jewish parent, there's part of getting a good education and being knowledgeable is so you can use it to be successful in life and support a family. So that was taught to Leonard at a very young age. His mother also taught him the importance of turning out a light. Yes, turning out a light. His family was quite poor and growing up, and so they had to conserve at every possible moment. And so my question to you is conserving energy a Jewish value? I'll just see if I can find that part. I don't think I marked it, but it was worthwhile. Anyway, it's not that important, but his mother taught him, you walk into a room and turn on a light, that costs a penny. So if you have to turn it on, turn it off as soon as you're done with it. It's still a habit of mine, walking out of a room and turning off the lights. But that was their sense of achievement, security. So is that a Jewish value, turning off a light? You bet it is. It's called Bal Tashchit, which is to be conservationist. And it's whether it's recycling or turning off a light when you leave a room. I think it's a Jewish value that should be taught to all Jewish kids. Not that we're obviously the exclusive owners of environmentalism, but I think it's something that's Jewish, is you don't waste things. And a lot of temples today, especially Reform synagogues, are what we call going green. And they're observing the ideas of recycling paper and turning off lights and doing as much as possible to be conservationist. So to me, that's a Jewish value. Leonard Nimoy gets Jewish value points for that. By the way, he passed away in 2015 at the age of 83. So he's one of the few personalities that we were studying who has sadly passed away. Oh, I learned a couple of things. I wasn't that much of a Trekkie. I didn't realize Star Trek was only on for 3 seasons because it loomed so large on the television horizon, and with all the sequels and movies that have and shows that have spawned off of that. His plastic ears have sold for as much as $3,000. Spock's fame created 2 things. One, burdens for his own children, who always had a sense of entitlement and really had difficulty with the idea of responsibility and making a living. Everything was handed to them on a silver platter, and he regrets that's one of the pitfalls of success. The other result of his fame was that his parents didn't care much for it. They were much more excited when he played Tevye in Fiddler in 1971. And I get, the way he explains it, they came from the old country, from a shtetl background. They just didn't understand sci-fi or the future or wearing strange makeup. They just didn't get Star Trek. And it was kind of like, what kind of job is this for a nice Jewish boy? So he really struggled with that his whole life, is that he never got the validation from his parents for being Spock that he wanted. And in 1975, he wrote a book, I Am Not Spock, because he did not want to be typecast in that character for the rest of his career, as much fame as it brought him. Actually, the inspiration for his acting career came from his first play at age 17. It was Clifford Odets' Awake and Sing. And as he describes it, there was so much that was Jewish in that play. I was 17 years old, cast in this local production with some pretty good amateur and semi-professional actors, playing this teenage kid in this Jewish family that was so much like mine. It was amazing. The same dynamics, the same tensions in the household. The family lived with the grandfather, who was a barber, just like mine, and the dominant mother was the power figure, which was the case in my family. My father was a shadow figure. And there were the same concerns about financial security. I felt like I was in a warm bath in this play. I was saying things that I would have liked to have said to my parents. And I thought if I could do this for the rest of my life, I'd be a very happy person. And he did other Yiddish roles or Jewish roles also. He played Morris Meyerson, Golda Meir's husband, in A Woman Called Golda in 1982. And he also, in 1991, was in the film Never Forget. He played Mel Mermelstein, who went to court in 1980 to prove that the Holocaust actually happened. So I guess Deborah Lipstadt wasn't the first one in Denial, the more recent film that we have, that we're all familiar with, because Leonard Nimoy played someone who did that years before. All right, so we come now to the most important thing I wanted to share with you about Leonard Nimoy, which was his use of the Vulcan Greeting, all right, which we all know looks very much like the priestly sign that's given during the benediction that's said in synagogue. And in fact, it's an actual derivative of his Jewish background. And this is a fascinating story. And it takes a little bit of reading, but I think it's very worthwhile to understand how and why he chose to use this priestly sign for the show. I was talking to this rabbi, cousin of ours, about that image one day. Rabbi John Rossoff of Temple Israel of Hollywood, a cousin of Nimoy's second wife, Susan Bay. And by the way, I know Rabbi Rossoff pretty well from our days at Camp Swig in Saratoga, a very good rabbi. And I told him that my childhood memory was that when these guys did this traditional blessing, it was really theatrical. These men from our synagogue would cover their heads with their prayer shawls, and they were shouters. These were old Orthodox shouting guys. About a half dozen of them would get up and face the congregation, chanting in a magical, mystical kind of way. They would start off by humming, Nimoy hums, and they were swaying and chanting, and then the guy would yell out, Yevarechecha Adonai, and then the whole bunch of them would, like a chorus, respond, Yevarechecha Adonai, all six of them. It was really spooky. So the congregation was all standing, and my father said to me, don't look. And in fact, everybody's got their eyes covered with their hands, or they've got their heads covered with their prayer shawl, the entire congregation. But I peeked, and I saw these guys doing this. So I introduced it into Star Trek. But I said to this rabbi cousin of ours, to this day, I'm not really sure why my father said, don't look. And he explained the traditional belief is that during that blessing, the Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God, enters the congregation to bless the congregation. And you shouldn't see God because the light could be fatal to a human. So you close your eyes to protect yourself. Well, I said, I never knew that. My father never said, close your eyes because God is coming. He just said, don't look. So that changed my life when John said that. That was only 5 or 6 years ago. The impact was enormous on me. Wow. Not only was there this whole theatrical thing going on, but here comes God, the female version. Whoa. So I thought, I'm going to photograph women. And that's exactly what he did. He started to photograph women. It's kind of like the verse from the prayer book, Magadlu Adonai ma'asacha kulam b'chachma asita. How great are your works, O Lord, with wisdom you have made them all. So that's the way he looked at the female body. Of course, in this day and age of the Me Too movement, I'm not sure how politically correct that would be, but he became a rather famous photographer, and he published a book called Shekhinah in 2002 that's filled with photographs of women. And as he describes this, and I love this idea of the way he describes God, and that's why I gave him God religion points. He started taking art pictures of women's bodies, some very sensual. I began to explore the idea of putting together this image with the female figure, and it ended up being a book. I love the idea that there's a feminine spiritual presence, because to me it's nurturing, it's compassionate, it's creative, it's aesthetic, it's warming, it's comforting. And in a strange kind of way, I guess this is the first time I'm trying to articulate this, I feel less judgmental of that presence than I would of a male presence. To the male God, I say, what are you doing? Where are you? What are you thinking? Why are you letting these terrible things happen in the world? Looking the other way, or saying, go ahead, work it out for yourselves. But this whole feminine thing, I don't have that kind of expectation, because to me, it doesn't present itself as being the all-powerful figure. It's a maternal figure. It's a loving figure. It's even an erotic figure. But it's not a power figure in the sense that it has control of everything. So I'm comfortable with it, and I'm comforted by it. I just love that. You know, the Shekhinah is one of the lower, there's 10 emanations of the divine in the mystical Kabbalistic tree of life. And at the very bottom, they have the Shekhinah, because that's the indwelling presence of God that permeates the earth. That's why he explained it that in the priestly benediction in the synagogue, the Shekhinah comes into the congregation to bless us. So it perfectly fits with Kabbalistic theology. And I just thought he had such a great understanding of that. And it opened up a new understanding for me in terms of, you know, we put so much pressure on a male God dominating things, but there's so many aspects to a feminine God, the comforting, the compassion, all of that. And I think it can have a positive impact on how we look at God and theology. So I thought that was really neat. Okay. I think we'll open it up to anyone else. He talks also about some of the anti-Semitism he experienced in Germany. He was so afraid to go to a Star Trek convention in Germany, but his rabbi convinced him, and it ended up being the most liberating experience, because they all these Germans stood up and applauded how he used the Vulcan Greeting from a Jewish symbol, and just how he was so open in proclaiming his Jewishness, and they loved it. So he ends with something that's so powerful. They were on their feet and they were cheering, and I was crying. It was incredible. And there was this message in it that I picked up that has something to do with, we are a new generation. We're a repairing generation. We are a reconstituting, healing generation. It was extraordinary. You know, kind of reminded me of Star Trek: The Next Generation. But that's the feeling that we got, Darlene and I, when we went to Berlin. They bent over backwards to show it is a new generation in Germany that's trying to make amends for the sins of the Holocaust. So let me open it up. Any thoughts, questions?
I'm going to share the spectrum on the screen so people can see that quick.
So I gave Leonard religion God points for his beautiful explanation of the Shekhinah, his culture, ethnicity points. You know, before he became famous for Star Trek, he was typecast, and he played bad Mexicans, and he played bad Indians, and he played bad Italians. He had a lot of roles where, you know, his looks enabled him to get those roles, and he didn't mind, because again, he was able to make a living. The anti-Semitism otherness comes from when he was 10 years old, and it started out with the anti-Semitic literature that was slipped in his bag, and he always carried a bit of that with him. Ethics, morals, and values, I gave him 10% on that, and study and learning as well, for the reasons that we talked about as we covered him. So that's how I divided up Leonard Nimoy, and there's his byline. I love the idea that there's a feminine spiritual presence. May the Shekhinah bless you and keep you. Okay. Any thoughts?
We have Susan Piddleman has a question.
Well,
oh, Susan, you're muted. Oh, still mute. Oh, there.
Okay, got it. I read on a little bit more about him, and he and his son had quite a rift. In fact, they didn't speak for a number of years, and his son did an article about how Jewish was Leonard Nimoy. His son tells all. And his son said that his career was always number one. He had a great love and respect for the fans, but trying to get him to look at me was very challenging. But then years later, Leonard Nimoy started to regret this, and he always had a big Passover Seder. And at the Seder, they would ask everybody who was there what kind of bondage did they feel that they personally were in. And his comment was that he really felt that he was imprisoned by his career, and that it took so much time away from his family that he can never get back, and he really regrets that. And so he really started to change his ways. And his son admitted that now his father was very interested in the grandchildren and the family, but that was something that he wasn't interested in when he was a famous star. So I thought it was interesting.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. All right.
That was it. So back to you.
Okay, let's move on with Wendy Wasserstein. She started out by saying, the only contact that I ever had with people who were not Jewish was on the Coney Island bus. So she was immersed in a Jewish upbringing. And as you know, she not only made her mark in Broadway, but she was considered to be the quintessential Jewish voice in the American theater. In her early play Uncommon Women and Others, the main character, Holly Kaplan, was the only Jew in her clique at WASP-heavy Mount Holyoke. The main character in Isn't It Romantic, Janie Bloomberg, rejects the Jewish doctor her parents want her to marry. And Wasserstein has described the three siblings in the Sisters Rosenzweig as a self-loathing Jew, a practicing Jew, and a wandering Jew. So you have to realize, her plays, and she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, her plays came in a time of rising feminism and rising ethnicity in terms of Jewish pride. So she combined that in a lot of her plays to make very compelling plays for Jewish women, not only to explore their Jewish identity, but to explore the very essence of their femininity. And that's where she really made her mark in the American theater through the Heidi Chronicles as well. She attended not only Mount Holyoke College, a very waspy liberal arts institution in Massachusetts for women, but she went to Brooklyn's Yeshiva of Flatbush, where she got a Jewish education. And she quite humorously reflected on years later when she was in Mount Holyoke and there would be dances with the men from the other colleges, the male colleges, she would run into some guys that she would know from the yeshiva. And she met a guy, and he introduced himself as Stanley Stone. She said, "Stanley Stone, you look so familiar. Weren't you Shmuel Starkhouse at the yeshiva?" So she found that a lot of the Jews who made it in college careers, they changed their names. They compromised their Jewish identity, but she would not do that. And when someone accused her that the Heidi Chronicles was too Jewish, she said the only thing that's Jewish about Heidi Chronicles is the author's last name. So she was very careful about that. Her mother was big on Jewish pride. She was the kind who would point to the TV and say, "Look, they're Jewish. Doesn't that reflect well on all of us?" But she thought Barry Goldwater was Barry Goldwasser, so she thought he was Jewish, and Wendy Wasserstein knew that he wasn't Jewish. And her father said, if you save up your pennies and quarters and give it to Israel, you will have a tree there with your name on it. And she said, "No, Dad, there's not going to be a tree with my name on it." So from a young age, she was pretty skeptical, and she didn't buy all the Bubba Mises that were told to her. But one thing that did stick is that true altruism is anonymous. That's what she learned. And that reminded me of Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah. There's 8 steps to tzedakah. And one of the highest levels is giving where the donor and the recipient do not know each other. The highest level, of course, is providing someone a job so that they can make their own living. But, not knowing who you're giving money to and not knowing who gave it to you is a very high level of tzedakah. So Wendy Wasserstein had a high degree of integrity. She also sadly passed away at a very young age, pretty quick after this book was published. But she was reviled by Jews with skewed values. She disliked Jews who are overly materialistic or condescending because they think that they're more observant or religious. They build a better sukkah, or they keep a higher degree of kashrut. She loved being around Jews, but not the kind of Jews who did those sorts of things. And she writes a little paragraph about that I want to share with you on this. Okay. All right, I have a number of selections here that I wanted to read. They were called the pish-pish people. The pish-pish people still seem to upset her. She's eager to remind them that all Jews are equal in the eyes of an anti-Semite. The ones who pretend they're Episcopalians because they're chicer than you are, because they're classy, the fanciest Jews whose children are named Brooke. To those people, I want to say, listen, honey, when push comes to shove, you're Jewish and so am I, and that's the bottom line, kid. So she just absolutely disliked that hypocrisy. She wasn't bothered by Jews in the news. Matter of fact, she thought Monica Lewinsky was a proud moment for the Jewish community because finally a Zoftic Jewish girl was viewed as a sex object. So for her, that was something positive. Her characters in her plays are products of her childhood. Matter of fact, Darlene and I saw her speak at Chautauqua some years ago, and she kept referring to her sister, Gorgeous. You know, Gorgeous was the one in the family who got all the attention, Gorgeous this, Gorgeous that, and that was indeed one of the sisters in the Sisters Rosenzweig, a sister named Gorgeous. Her characters are clearly products of her childhood, and there's a clear sense of association as well. On the other hand, I think there's a warmth and irony. There's an ability in some ways, in a good tribal way, to look at others as family. So there's an inclusiveness. I sent my daughter to the Y for a reason. The 92nd Street Y Nursery School, where her daughter Lucy Jane attends at the time we talk, offers a kind of preparatory Jewish education. I thought Lucy might as well know this heritage, and later she can choose whatever. So she gets association points. And they celebrate everything, Jewish, Christian, secular holidays, but she cares about Israel also. And that probably goes back to her father saying that she would have a tree in her name in Israel. And she writes very poignantly, I worry about whether Israel, it will survive and whether the world really cares about Israel. I think that part of the world believes that if we could just move the country to Iceland or Pluto, it would be a lot easier. Or to Martha's Vineyard. That would be really nice because all the Jews would be happy, and a lot of them have homes there because they're pretending that they're actually Episcopalian, so it would work out nicely. And Bill Clinton could come and play golf, and everyone could shop. So I love that. I love that ending. Let's see the Jewish identity spectrum for Wendy Wasserstein. All right. Culture, ethnicity, and by the way, she saw taking her daughter. She was taken to the theater quite often, and she took her daughter. Took her daughter to the theater, and she felt that was a Jewish act to support the cultural arts. So she gets high points for culture, ethnicity, points for association in terms of what she said about just feeling the sense of connection with other Jews, tradition, heritage. And her being worried about the future of Israel and Zionism, so she got a little credit for that. But clearly the tradition, the heritage that was passed on to her meant quite a bit to her too, and it came out in her plays. So any comments about Wendy Wasserstein? I want to give at least 10 minutes to Richard Dreyfuss because there's a lot to cover for that.
Can I just add, Rabbi, that I thought it was interesting that she shared so much of her life and her thoughts and her relationship with her mother in her plays, but yet she really didn't share her illness with anyone. They said that people were very, very surprised when she passed away, that she had uterine cancer, and she didn't tell anybody about it. And that her daughter then went to live with her brother until he passed away. But I had the privilege of hearing her speak in Milwaukee, and she was fabulous. And I love the Heidi Chronicles and all of her plays, and encourage you to follow up and try to see them, because she was really a very, very talented, wonderful woman.
Oh, extremely witty. The plays just have such sharp, crisp dialogue, and and there's so much Jewishness. It's really a crash course in reflecting on one's own Jewish identity. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, anyone else?
I don't see anyone else, so why don't you get started so that we don't go too much over.
Out of everything I found in going through stuff this week, I found a real gem for Richard Dreyfuss. I was going through old VHS tapes, and I found one where Richard Dreyfuss addressed the entire assembly at the UAHC convention in 1993 in San Francisco. I thought, I have got to play this. Thank goodness I have a combination VCR DVD player. So I popped it in, and I am telling you, it was an unbelievable speech. He sounded like a wise rabbi, almost with statesman-like quality. And he reflected on his background growing up in Beverly Hills and the education he got at Temple Emmanuel. And he spoke about the Jewish values that have always been a part of him. And he said two things that really stuck. He talked about the importance of tikkun olam, which is one of the categories on our Jewish identity spectrum. And he mentioned something else. He said the primary ethical value by which he conducted his life was that which is hateful to you. Do not do unto others. And I remember I was reading this in one of our personalities, and it might have been somebody else because I've read a few others in addition. And if any of you remember, but they phrased it as the golden rule: do unto others of what you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule. That was not good enough for Hillel. And the Jewish version of that is the golden rule in the negative, exactly what Richard Dreyfuss said. That which is hateful to you, do not do unto others, because that encompasses such a wider range of behavior. To not do something that's hateful to you is going to encompass a lot more things than just do unto others as you'd have them do it to you, which is why the Jewish people phrase the golden rule in the negative. But I was fascinated that he mentioned those two things. And think about this now. This is November or December 1993. What happened that year? In September, it was the handshake on the White House lawn with President Clinton presiding over Menachem Begin and Yasser Arafat. It was such a time of great optimism in the Jewish world. We finally thought Israel and the Palestinians were going to have peace. And so he reflected on some of his own ideas, and he's very much a peacenik, and he did a lot of work for Americans for Peace Now. And so he was criticized for that roundly because people accused him of giving away the state of Israel, and that it was never going to work, that Israel would be overrun by the Palestinians. They would attack the minute they could, but that's what he believed. He's very much a believer in the state being shared, being a two-state solution. But just to hear him speak about that time of optimism, and we all remember that, how excited and that we finally thought peace was on the horizon. And of course, just a few years later was the first Intifada. But just to, hearing, I wish I could, any of you, if you'd like a copy of his remarks, I can, make a copy on my fancy VCR DVD combo player and get copies out to you. But it was just such a beautiful statement that he made. Okay. He starts out in the chapter by saying he doesn't agree that actors like him and Dustin Hoffman broke the Hollywood mold of the leading man, because there were others who really did that. But the mold that they did break was proudly proclaiming as actors, I'm Jewish and I'm proud of it. He actually played up his Jewishness at auditions in order to distinguish himself and to set himself apart from the crowd, because he did not want to be typecast. So he was reluctant to push his Judaism too far, but he used it as an advantage to make himself a little different from the others. But really, to get all the roles that he wanted, the rule in Hollywood is never admit to anything except one thing, which is that you're everything. And if someone asks you if you're familiar with riding horses, your answer is, are you kidding? I grew up on a ranch. So he kind of, threaded a fine line between saying, I'm proud to be Jewish, but I'm still a regular guy and I can do it all. He talks about Bayside in New York, that's where he grew up until he was 8.5 years old, as a hotbed of left-wing liberal Jewish stuff. Now, compare this to Jerome Groopman, who grew up in Bayside, who, what he remembers is the love and affection that he saw from other men. And just in terms of being a warm community, a close-knit community, and men could hug each other and be good to each other and treat each other with great love and affection. But for Richard Dreyfuss, Bayside was where he learned liberal politics. And his father would take out his guitar on a hot summer night, and the whole neighborhood would start singing Union songs and just I Had a Dream Last Night. You know, any protest song would be part of his upbringing. Then when he was 8 years old, they moved out to Beverly Hills, where he attended Temple. Well, actually, he was at the West Side Jewish Community Center and then Temple Emmanuel in Beverly Hills. And his father kind of said, I'm going to give you a choice. You know, I'm not really that religious myself, but I think it's important that you familiarize yourself with Jewish tradition. So I'm going to give you a choice: have a bar mitzvah, or you can be confirmed. But I don't think you should have a bar mitzvah, because that's a waste of time, and you really will learn a lot more in confirmation. So much for the unbiased opinion of his father. Richard laughs about that. So he opted to be confirmed, and he said it was the greatest learning experience of his life. And he talks about this in the message to the Biennial Convention, about the impact that learning. It wasn't just learning about Jewish holidays and rituals. He learned about he got the deepest philosophical, ethical questions about life answered for him by these rabbis, the teachers, the ones who taught him in confirmation. And it had such an impact on his sense of Jewishness. He is not religious. He does not buy into the rituals at all, but he believed that the study, the learning was extremely important to him. And as we said, the social justice as well. He also, he had a lot of the people we've studied have had at least two marriages, and the men have tended to marry a non-Jewish woman who they ended up getting a divorce, and then they married a Jewish woman because they realized how important their Judaism was to them in the end. And Richard Dreyfuss had a particularly bad experience. The woman that he asked to marry, he said, I would like you to convert, and she agreed, but she did not hold to the promise, and that really soured him. And his first wife moved the kids to Idaho, and basically he lost his kids to any further Jewish identity because he had no control over that. So he was always sorry about that, because he wanted his kids to at least have a sense of their Jewishness, if not, even though they never went to temple. He could never get the spiritual aspects of Judaism, the aspects that offer comfort and support in times of trial. He just never got it. So he admits that. He just was never a spiritual Jew. His sister, Kathy, reminds him a bit, though, that even when the kids went to Idaho, they could have had holidays with her, but he just never followed through on that. His second wife, Janella, converted, kept kosher for 2 years, did let it go, but he talks a little bit about his first role in The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. He was roundly criticized for that because it was about a Jewish hustler, and it portrayed a kind of a negative stereotype of Jews. He also regained his father's Jewish paranoia in a film called Inserts, and I realize I have just a couple of minutes to go. The film that Dreyfuss says caused him for the first time to adopt his father's Jewish paranoia was a flop called Inserts. He experienced disturbing flashbacks to World War II, which he says were not connected to the movie, but to his visit to Germany to promote it. The German accents alone made him physically sick. Sometime around 1975, I went to Munich to do a publicity junket. I was being interviewed one day in a Munich hotel by this German lady, and I said, "Excuse me," and I puked in a potted plant in the lobby. And he also talks about just that he was with Veronica Cartwright, and they were in a place in Germany, and it was like being in a Munich beer hall of the 1923 putsch. And so it just filled him with terror, and it hit him that these people did this unspeakable thing to my family. So he was so angry about the Holocaust and what that did to our people. And at least that led to his longtime activism on behalf of peace in Israel. And again, he's very much a dove. He works for Americans for Peace now, and he believes that the only hope is for the Jews to be a better people. And he believes very strongly, and this is the line I picked, he believes in the chosen people, that the Jews are better. And he knows this is probably politically incorrect. It sort of smacks of superiority, but here's his final paragraph. Mankind loses and gains its soul every day. We are part of this story. The Jews are meant to be better, or else my life as a believer in the Jewish tale has no meaning. If the Jews are not better, if the Jews do not act and think more clearly, more courageously, more intellectually, finely than others, then my love for Judaism is reduced to the love that someone else has for a baseball team. Are the Jews better? Well, that's kind of elitist, but they better be. They better be. So I think in the context of Israel peace negotiations, Israel is going to lose its soul unless they offer a compassionate, sensitive solution to the Palestinians. And that's how he feels that, we're chosen to be better, to act on a higher moral level, and, politically correct or not, that's what he believes. That's why I chose this line, as we're going to see now, as we put up his Jewish identity spectrum. And because he's so committed to so many things Jewish, he got the most categories out of any of the people we've studied. I gave him points in 7 of the 10 categories of Jewish identity. Let's see that now.
Rabbi Mueller, just because we're a few minutes over, I am going to, first I'm going to share next week's personalities that we're going to be looking at. And then for those who can stay on for a few more minutes, then I'll bring up the Jewish identity spectrum. All right. So for those of you who need to leave, stay on for one more second so I can tell you who we're going to be studying next week. So as you can see, our final week of this course is going to be next Monday. We'll be looking at Gloria Steinem, Mark Spitz, Norman Lear, and Diane von Furstenberg. So please, you can see it here, and we'll also be emailing it out if you would like to read ahead. And now I will stop sharing this. Invite those of you who need to leave. Thank you for being with us. This is being recorded, so if you need to leave and you want to catch the last couple minutes, you will be able to see that. And now, Rabbi Mueller, I will share the other screen that you wanted. One moment. All right, there you go.
So there you have it. We are the chosen people. The Jews must work to make the world better because the Jews must be better than everyone else. So because of his work on behalf of Israel, he gets 20% for their social justice. He's big on that, and tikkun olam. His sense of anti-Semitism from how his parents felt about the Holocaust is absolutely there. His association and community, history survival. He wrote a paragraph just about how important the fact that the Jews have survived after 4,000 years of persecution. That's in the chapter also. I didn't get to that. The study, the learning, what his confirmation class meant to him, gave him points for that. And just the ethics, morals, and values of Judaism, that is, which is do not, anything which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. This is an example of his commitment to ethics and morals. So there you have it. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week for our last installment of Stars of David. Have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thank you all, and keep a lookout for a follow-up email.